Hi, this is Sarah, and I am going to show you how to stitch a couple of quilted blocks together using a 1-inch wide piece of sashing. This is the very same technique that I'm using for the Abundance collection in both of the tote bags. Let's get started. So I'm sitting at my sewing machine and I have one of the blocks that's been trimmed to 4.5 inches square, and I also have this 1-inch wide piece of sashing here. A note on the trimming, I had a question about this a couple of days ago. When you trim the 4-inch block, the quilting is going to go right into the seam allowance. And I did this on purpose. Instead of having the quilting finish at 4 inches with nothing in the seam allowance, when I tried that the first time around, the block tends to be a little bit smaller than the 4 inches, so you don't necessarily get such a nice edge around the quilting. So the quilting is going to go right the way into the seam allowance for the 4-inch blocks and the 5-inch blocks. So here we go. We've got block number 1, and we're going to put the sashing right side down so that the edge is aligned with the edge of the block. And I'm going to stitch a scant 1/4 inch seam. Now I'm using the number 34 foot here on my Bernina 830, and I moved the needle all the way over to the right hand side, and then I moved it one back to the left. And before I start sewing, it would be a really good idea to actually have some thread in the needle. Didn't notice that that hadn't happened. Here we go. Okay, so I like to use the number 34 foot because I find I get a much more accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance when I've got the edge of the thing that I'm stitching right on the edge of the foot, which is also lined up the 3/8 of an inch mark. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to stitch right the way down that seam, and I like to do all of my seams with a 2mm long stitch. Okay, so now I am going to finger press that open. If you see the shiny on the sashing, this is a scrap of the laminated fabric that I used for the 5-inch tote that I'm using here for the sashing. So now that I've got that first side, or that first block, joined to the sashing, and I've finger pressed it open, now I'm going to bring in my second block and make sure that I have the blocks oriented the way that I want them to be. So I guess it's going to end up looking like that. And then I'm going to flip the block with the sashing right side down on top of the second block, line the edge of the sashing up with the edge of the second block, and I'm going to stitch again. Now, if you'll notice that the foot is sitting kind of on an uneven slope here, and what I found is that it's actually easier to flip everything upside down so that the sashing is on the bottom. It just seems to be a little bit easier to be more accurate. So now I'm going to stitch this side again. I've got my scant 1/4 inch seam here. Trim the ends of my thread off, and now when I open this up and give it a good finger press, there I have a beautiful 1 inch, or it actually ends up now being a 1/2 inch piece of sashing that's joining the two blocks, and on the back side they should be butted right up against each other. So this is a completely flat seam, and it's really that easy. I almost forgot to tell you that I like to put a 1 inch wide strip of fusible interfacing on the back to cover the seam allowance, or the join between the two blocks. I like to use Pellon Shape Flex. It's just 1 inch wide strip, 4.5 inches long, to go right along the seam, fuse it in place, and it gives you a little bit more stability to your seam.